Flashback, Saturday the 25th of February 1995 at the London Arena, London, the United Kingdom. WBC Super Middleweight World Champion Nigel Benn from the UK with a record of 39-2-1 took on his mandatory challenger Gerald McClellan from the United States with a record of 31-2-0. Now going into this fight, Nigel Benn was a big underdog. The majority of the press and the pundits expected Nigel Benn to not only lose, but lose early in the fight. And I'm talking about the British press here, not just the American press. The only person in the build-up to the fight who I remember picking Nigel Benn to win, and that was actually on the night of the fight, was John McCririck, who is better known as a horse racing pundit. He does odds and whatever for horse racing. And I remember him on the night on the ITV broadcast, which was on terrestrial television, free to air back then. He picked Nigel Benn, but everybody else, I remember Barry McGuigan picking Gerald McClellan to win early and all these other people. Now, Nigel Benn was a respected champion, but he wasn't seen as a feared champion at all at this point. Early on in Nigel Benn's career, he was very aggressive and reckless back down at middleweight, but he was intimidating. A lot of fighters were scared of Nigel Benn's punching power and his ferocity. He suffered his first loss to Michael Watson. He was stopped in the Watson fight, but he came back from that and he captured the WBO World Middleweight title. He knocked out people like Iran Barkley. He knocked out Doug DeWitt. Those fights were in the United States. But then he fought Chris Eubanks Sr., and it was a similar situation to the Watson fight. He wasn't quite as hyper-aggressive and reckless against Eubanks Sr. as he was against Watson, but the fight followed a similar pattern, with Nigel Benn having a fast start, but eventually tiring out and getting taken out by Eubanks Sr. late on. And I think Nigel Benn also exerted a lot of emotional energy in that fight because he hated Eubanks Sr. so much. It kind of played into Eubanks Sr.'s hands and he just burned up all his energy hating the guy so much, even in the ring. So he lost to Eubanks Sr., regrouped, and managed to go over to Italy and beat Galvano for the WBC Super Middleweight title this time. He moved up in weight. And then he went on a run as WBC Super Middleweight champion, which culminated in this fight here with Gerald McClellan. During that run as champion, which included the rematch with Chris Eubanks Sr., Nigel Benn reined in the aggression. He wasn't as reckless. He wasn't as hyper-aggressive as he was prior to the loss to Eubank and certainly prior to the loss to Michael Watson. He used a lot more boxing. He was a lot more circumspect with his approach. And even then, he'd had some performances where he got rocked a few times, where there was a few shaky moments in some of his fights. And I remember one of the fights that he had before fighting McClellan. It might have been the fight immediately prior to the McClellan fight. I can't remember now. But he fought some South American guy. He was from Peru or somewhere like that. The guy had like a big square jaw, and Benn was tagging this guy with his best shots and nothing was happening. I remember Nigel Benn boxing on the back foot a little bit in that fight. And, at the time that he fought McClellan, Benn was kind of a veteran at that stage. He wasn't just this wild, young fighter coming in, throwing the big shots, because that had backfired on him before when he'd stepped up. So I guess he thought to himself, you know what, I'm not going to try and do that again. And it was the same in the Eubanks Sr. rematch. That was during his time as WBC Super Middleweight World Champion when Eubanks Sr. was WBO champion. They had a fight, a rematch, and it was kind of a stalemate. It was a draw, and it didn't live up to the action of their first fight mainly because Nigel Benn was a lot more cautious in the rematch and he boxed a lot more. He wasn't just wild swinging and trying to knock Eubank out. So yeah, going into the McClellan fight, I believe, in judging from the first round, that Nigel Benn intended to try and carry that on and actually box a little bit with McClellan, at least for the first few rounds, to see the lay of the land. And I'll get on to analyzing and breaking down the fight and giving my reflections on it later on in the video. But first of all, I want to talk about McClellan. Now, McClellan was one of the most precocious talents to come out of the Crunk gym, the famous gym in Detroit, trained by Manny Stewart for most of his professional career. He had suffered a couple of losses on points early on in his career. And I believe those were times when he wasn't with Manny Stewart. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe he wasn't with Manny Stewart. He'd broken away from him. They've had whatever disagreement. He'd had those losses. Or perhaps it was a situation where maybe he was with Stewart, but he wasn't paying attention to what Stewart was saying, etc. Because I remember Manny Stewart talking about his relationship with Gerald McClellan. But anyway, he suffered a couple of points losses. He came back from those. He managed to become the world champion at middleweight by knocking out Julian Jackson, who's one of the most feared punchers of all time. Anybody who don't know about Julian Jackson, go YouTube him. He was an incredible puncher. Perhaps, and a lot of people regard him as this, perhaps the hardest punching middleweight of all time. Certainly up there. I mean, the amount of one-punch knockouts Julian Jackson had is a lot. It can't be slept on. So McClellan had 2 fights with Julian Jackson. The first fight was really a war. Both guys traded heavy leather. Gerald McClellan showed his incredible ability to absorb punches. McClellan always had an iron jaw. There was a story dating back to when McClellan was a 17-year-old amateur. I believe he was an amateur at the time, not a young pro. Correct me if I'm wrong, if any of you know better. But McClellan was a 17-year-old in the Crunk gym, and he was sparring with Tommy Hearns, who was a world championship level fighter at the time as a professional. And Tommy Hearns was getting the better of McClellan in sparring, apparently, and whispering in his ear in the clinches and just trying to rile him up and upset him. And it turned into an altercation after the sparring. An altercation in which McClellan went for Tommy Hearns, and Hearns cracked McClellan bang on the chin with his hardest possible right hand. And anybody that knows anything about Tommy Hearns will tell you that he was a tremendous puncher himself. And he cracked McClellan, a 17-year-old McClellan, bang on the chin. And according to Manny Stewart, McClellan barely even blinked. And he said when he saw that, he realized this guy's got an iron jaw. And indeed, for the rest of McClellan's career, nobody was really able to dent his chin, not even Nigel Benn. I never really saw McClellan genuinely hurt in a fight. When he got knocked out by Benn, I'll get to the circumstances around that, but it wasn't really from being discombobulated from any one punch. Anyway, he was feared, Gerald McClellan, as a middleweight, certainly, particularly after the way he dispatched of Jackson. In the first fight, it was a back and forth battle, but eventually McClellan landed a huge right hand on Julian Jackson, which, I mean, it was literally like he was throwing a javelin when he landed that right hand against Jackson. I believe that was in the 5th round in the first fight. And he followed it up with a left hook, which stretched Jackson flat on his back. Jackson got up, but he was in no state, and McClellan promptly finished him. He had a couple of defenses after the first Jackson fight. Then he fought a rematch with Jackson. He knocked Jackson out in 1 round in the rematch. And yeah, shortly after that, I can't remember if he had another couple of defenses after that, but shortly after that, he moved up to super middleweight. And the plan was, Gerald McClellan was promoted by Don King. The plan was to have Gerald McClellan beat Nigel Benn for the WBC super middleweight world title and then take on the superstar of the division, who at the time was Roy Jones Jr. That was the plan. Very few people, as I say, in Britain or in the United States, thought that McClellan would have too much problem getting the title off Nigel Benn. So even though he'd never fought a super middleweight before, he was immediately installed by the WBC as Benn's mandatory challenger. Again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe that's how it went. I believe he didn't have any fights at super middleweight prior to fighting Benn. He just became mandatory challenger. Such is the close nature that Don King had, the close nature of the relationship that Don King had with the WBC. So he was the feared guy. He was knocking everybody out. He knocked out the dynamite puncher in Julian Jackson. He was the guy with the iron jaw. Nigel Benn was the guy who was a bit vulnerable, a guy who was a bit more cautious these days. He's not the old Dark Destroyer that he used to be. Nigel Benn was already in his early 30s by the time he fought McClellan. McClellan was still in his 20s. So, it was what it was. Now, when the first bell went for this fight between Nigel Benn and McClellan. And again, I have to reiterate, this is one of the most incredible fights I've ever seen. In terms of the atmosphere, it was feverish. It was like a bear pit. It was like what you imagine the Roman Colosseum to be like, with the crowd just screaming for blood and all these faces at ringside. Frank Bruno banging on the ring apron and all this kind of stuff. Don King up and down, and Frank Warren and Prince Nassim in the crowd. It was just a feverish atmosphere. Incredible atmosphere. The most incredible atmosphere I've ever seen at a boxing match. And the first bell went, and it looked as though Nigel Benn was going to continue trying to be that cagey veteran, which he'd been during his run as WBC super middleweight champion. And I know he knocked out a few people during his run as WBC super middleweight champion, like Nicky Piper, Lou Gent, and a bunch of other people. But still, he wasn't as aggressive as he was in his younger days. He was more circumspect. And it looked like that's what he was trying to do in the Gerald McClellan fight. Be a bit circumspect and, give McClellan room. That was the worst mistake he could have made in the first round. And he nearly paid for it by getting knocked out in the first round. McClellan pinned him up against the ropes, unleashed a barrage. Nigel Benn was trying to duck and dive, something which he'd done in some of his recent fights, ducking and diving on the ropes. It didn't work against Gerald McClellan. His punches were far too straight and well delivered, and he punched Nigel Benn through the ropes. Benn, according to some, was given too long to get back in the ring. He was also, some people say he was pushed back in the ring by some of the journalists, but the journalists were putting their hands out to stop him falling on them. That has to be said too. Regardless, Nigel Benn got back in the ring. He was in no way coherent. He was wobbling all over the place. I remember the commentator at the time, Reg Gutteridge, said that Ben's eyes were in separate orbit. They were doing, each eye was doing something different. And a lot of people complained about the referee, French referee, because he was very fussy. And they say that he helped Nigel Benn out and helped him survive that first round. I mean, certainly the way that first round went, a lot of fights would have been stopped, particularly in this day and age. Back then, they let fights go on a bit longer than they do today. There wasn't as many premature stoppages back then as they are today. There was still some, and terrible ones, but generally, they let fights go on a little bit longer back then. And, today, Nigel Benn probably would have been stopped in the first round against Gerald McClellan. The way he was out on his feet, McClellan a murderous puncher coming at him. Nigel Benn known for having a bit of a shaky chin. It was a miracle, really, that Nigel Benn was able to survive that first round. But something happened in the corner between rounds. It was one of the most dramatic turnarounds you'll ever see in a fight. After Nigel Benn was up against the ropes because he decided to give Gerald McClellan space and be a bit circumspect and see what it had in the first round, that didn't work. So after all that had happened and he barely survived the first round, Nigel Benn, in his own head, I guess, said, you know what? I have to put it on this guy. I have to get respect from this guy. If he's going to knock me out, I'm not going to get knocked out without trying to knock him out first. So now it's going to be the return of the old Nigel Benn, the Dark Destroyer, the guy from the Michael Watson days. And Nigel Benn probably didn't make this as a conscious decision. It was probably just instinct, which told him, I got to fight back. I got to hurt this guy. And he came out in the second round with that intention of going forward and taking a fight to McClellan. From a stylistic point of view, from a tactical point of view, it was the perfect counter to what McClellan was doing to him. The reason why is because Nigel Benn reverted back to almost a Mike Tyson influence type style that he had earlier on in his career, where he used to do a lot of bobbing and weaving coming forward. Gerald McClellan was a guy who never threw a lot of uppercuts. He'd throw hooks and straight shots and jabs, but he never threw a lot of uppercuts. And on top of that, McClellan was always a guy with a very, very poor defense. He needed the iron jaw that he had because his defense was terrible, even against Julian Jackson. He was wide open to Jackson's big shots and he got hit with plenty of them. Against Nigel Benn, his lack of an uppercut and his lack of a defense played into Benn's hands when Ben started coming forward, bobbing and weaving. Because the straight shots were whistling over the top of Nigel Benn's head, for the most part, as he was coming forward and, bobbing and weaving. And then he would come up with these hooks, Tyson or Joe Frazier style, which would catch McClellan bang on the jaw, because McClellan was a guy who liked to stand up straight. Not much upper body movement from Gerald McClellan. So Ben was able to switch his style. If you want to talk about somebody adjusting, Nigel Benn adjusted very, very well in that McClellan fight between two different styles. The circumspect style, which he'd had for the majority of his reign as WBC super middleweight champion, and then the more aggressive style, the kind of Mike Tyson, Joe Frazier influence style, which he'd had early on in his professional boxing career. That's what he switched back to in that second round. And it was like night and day. I mean, you could never imagine the way Ben looked in that first round. You could never imagine him coming out in the second round and dominating the second round from the bell. But that's exactly what happened. It was an incredible turnaround. I mean, even actually at the end of the first round, he landed a couple of shots on Gerald McClellan. He did get his bearings a little bit. But at the start of the second round, it was like night and day compared to the first round. Switched his style up, and all of a sudden, McClellan couldn't land his shots. Them straight shots that he was landing and them hooks he was landing in the first round, he couldn't land them in the second round. Or in the third round, and on it went. McClellan wasn't able to adjust to that. McClellan wasn't able to tighten up his defense. He wasn't able to get any uppercuts in because he had an underdeveloped uppercut. The left and right uppercuts from McClellan were never really, part of a strong part of his arsenal. And that's what he needed against Ben. Defense and uppercuts. So Ben was able to get himself back into the fight, and he looked on the way to potentially winning on points up until the 8th round. I believe it was the 8th when he got dropped. He was in the corner. McClellan dropped him again. Somehow he managed to survive. Got out of that round. Then in the 9th round, he swung at McClellan from quite a long distance and actually threw himself off balance, and his head hit McClellan in the face. And Nigel Benn dropped to the canvas trying to, reach McClellan with some wild shot. And McClellan took a knee at that point. And I remember the commentators saying that that's not a good sign for McClellan, that he's going down, taking a knee and wanting some time to recover from getting grazed by Nigel Benn's head. That's not a good sign. What we all didn't know at the time is that Gerald McClellan was probably bleeding on the brain even then. Throughout the fight, well, actually after a couple of rounds, the commentators noted that McClellan was blinking very heavily, constantly blinking every few seconds. They had said that even in training camp, McClellan had been doing this. And I know that the safety measures in boxing were reformed in Britain after what happened to Gerald McClellan. And I'm not sure if it was before or after McClellan that brain scans became mandatory in Britain. I can't remember if it was before or after that. But still, now in the UK, brain scans are mandatory. So it's possible that McClellan suffered some type of concussion or some type of injuries to his brain prior to the Ben fight in training camp. And then again, there's going to be the cumulative injuries that McClellan may have suffered to his brain throughout his career because of the fact that he had an iron jaw and no defense. Sometimes having an iron jaw is actually bad for your health because you get hit with a lot more punches because you can take them without going down. And that's what happened to McClellan in the Ben fight. McClellan was getting lit up from the second round on by Nigel Benn, getting hit with just countless flush power shots bang on the chin. Another thing people complain about in the McClellan fight was the fact that Nigel Benn was landing a lot of rabbit punches on McClellan. And that is also true, but he was landing a hell of a lot more clean punches on McClellan's chin than he was landing rabbit punches. That has to be said. So anyway, 9th round, McClellan goes down on one knee, complaining about being headbutted. Commentators are saying, well, bad signs for McClellan, looks like he wants to quit. 10th round comes, Ben lands a combination of fairly innocuous looking punches. I remember a kind of a right hand landed from Ben, then an uppercut, and McClellan took a knee. And he was blinking. He got up from that. Ben came in. That was the first knockdown that Ben scored in the fight. Ben had been down twice himself. And then the first time McClellan went down was in the 10th. Took a knee, got up. Nigel Benn went in again. Hit him with another couple shots that didn't seem that hard, but McClellan went down again and sat out the count. His promoter, Don King, was screaming at him to get up, while McClellan stayed on the ground until he was counted out. Then he got up and walked to his corner. And in retrospect, it was very clear that there was something very, very wrong with Gerald McClellan at the time. He was blinking. He quit, and people at the time were questioning his heart. I remember Jim Watt was one of the commentators, as well as Reg Gutteridge, on that fight. And Jim Watt actually said during the instant replay that, it might have been during the instant replay, but it was certainly after the fight was over. Jim Watt said there was nothing wrong with Gerald McClellan's chin. His head was clear as a whistle. His eyes were clear as a whistle or clear as a bell. But his chin could still take the punches, but his heart could not. So Jim Watt just assumed that this guy quit because Ben beat the fight out of him. He didn't realize that Gerald McClellan was actually suffering from a brain injury. And I know it's, hindsight is 2020, but none of us realized it. I'm sure there was a lot of people there saying, McClellan's bottled it. They weren't to know that the guy was actually in serious trouble in terms of the injury that he suffered. It was a tragic, tragic time. And this is something which has actually changed in boxing in terms of the coverage of these type of injuries. Back then, when fighters like Michael Watson and Gerald McClellan and what was the guy called? Was it Bradley Stone? I think the guy was called Bradley Stone. Another guy who was seriously hurt in a British boxing ring. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure if Beats or one of those guys is watching this video, they'll tell me the name. But there was this guy, a British fighter in one of the lighter weights. I think he was called Bradley Stone. And he got beaten by a Scouse fighter whose name escapes me. And Bradley Stone I think he died actually. He didn't just suffer a serious injury. So anyway, back then when fighters would suffer these type of injuries, it was a big news story. And I guess in recent times, the Nick Blackwell incident was a big news story. But since Nick Blackwell, several fighters have suffered injuries, like Edward Goodneck, for example. And it hasn't really been covered on the news that much. Back then, the Michael Watson fight, the incident that happened with Michael Watson where he got badly injured, that was all over the news in the UK for weeks. And there were people calling for boxing to be banned. It was just a big hot topic for a long time. And it certainly was after the McClellan fight too. A big, big hot topic. And it was actually shortly after the McClellan fight that terrestrial television in the United Kingdom stopped showing professional boxing. Or they at least pulled back from it in a big way after the McClellan fight. And that's when Frank Warren took his fighters to Sky, because ITV were like, you know what, we can't do this because we don't want to be a part of something so brutal where people are getting crippled and killed, and we don't want to be part of it no more. So then, Warren took his fighters to Sky Sports, and Warren at the time was, promoting Nigel Benn. So yeah, that was a very memorable fight in my life. I will never forget the night that fight took place. Me and my brother watching the fight, screaming at the television, my heart beating out my chest, and the feeling of horror and sadness after the fight. Initially it was jubilation that Nigel Benn had won. And I remember his post-fight interview where he was saying, I'm the Dark Destroyer and, never underestimate me again. And Ben was there with a jaw. I mean, just to emphasize what a brutal fight it was and how tough Nigel Benn is. Ben had a jaw that was swollen to the size of a melon. And Ben himself was in hospital for 10 days or something after the fight, pissing blood for days and days after the fight because he'd taken so many brutal shots to the body, the jaw like a flipping melon. And that's the guy that won. The guy who lost was tragically left paralyzed and blind for the rest of his life, Gerald McClellan, in a very, very bad way. So there was the elation of Ben winning, and then there was the horror of Gerald McClellan being left with life-changing injuries and being left as a cripple and a vegetable. So a very memorable fight, a memorable incident, a memorable time in British boxing history. So I thought I'd just share my memories of that time with you guys. I remember actually, I used to think it was on the undercard. I think it was actually the week before in fact, it definitely was the week before, I'm pretty sure. Frank Bruno fought on ITV. I believe it was a week before Ben McClellan. And he knocked out a guy called Rodolfo Marin. Yeah, I remember that fight very clearly. I think it was a Puerto Rican guy. And Frank Bruno knocked him over in one round. And Manny Stewart was there. He was either there or he certainly commented on the fight. I think he was there. And he said about Rodolfo Marin after seeing him get knocked out by Bruno, he said that guy wouldn't even qualify to shadow box in our gymnasium. That was kind of typical of some of the guys that Frank Bruno fought in some of his comeback fights. He did fight a lot of knockover jobs, and that was one of them. I can't remember if Frank Bruno was top of the bill on that card, or whether it was Prince Nassim, because in those days, Prince Nassim was fighting on ITV. You know, they were all with Frank Warren. Warren had Nigel Benn, he had Frank Bruno, he had Prince Nassim, and, you know, a bunch of other guys, you know, fighting on ITV. Imagine that. Top quality boxing, world-class fighters, world-class fights, all taking place on ITV. The Gerald McClellan Nigel Benn fight had something like 17.5 million viewers. Just incredible. Boxing was so different back then. You could watch quality stuff like that for free. You know, with 17 million people watching. Incredible numbers. Will we ever see numbers like that again in the UK for boxing? Probably not, because most boxing is behind the paywall these days. But even on terrestrial television, we probably won't see those kind of numbers again, because back then there was far fewer television channels. So people didn't have so much choice about what they were going to watch. People weren't pulled this way or that way by different distractions as much as they are today. So when they were promoting Ben McClellan on ITV, everybody had heard about it. You know, it wasn't difficult to promote because there wasn't that many platforms as there is today. So, yeah, those are my memories of the fight, people. Hope you enjoyed the video. Drop a comment in the comment section below if you remember watching this fight live like I do. And also, drop a comment and tell me of any other fights that I may have seen or whatever. I mean, I've seen a lot of fights over the years, particularly fights from the 90s. I didn't miss anything. But drop a comment below if there are any other fights you want me to do a flashback video on. And I'll see what I can do. And also, if you want to receive notifications for my uploads, don't forget to click the bell symbol below this video. It should be right next to the subscribe button, or somewhere near it anyway. I'm not sure exactly where it appears if you're using your smartphone, but certainly on a laptop or a computer, it's right beside the subscribe button. There's a bell symbol. Click that symbol and you'll receive notifications whenever I upload a video. All right? So make sure you do that. And yeah, thanks for watching. It's happening. I'm out.